middle of the 9th century AD, a little-known military clash in what is now the eastern part of Turkey gave rise to one of the great boasts in history. The occasion was an attack by the Byzantine Emperor Theophilus II on the border town of Zipatra. What did the town border? The northwestern edge of the Abbasid Caliphate, a Muslim empire based in Baghdad that appeared to be on the tail end of a widely touted Islamic golden age. Certainly, Emperor Theophilus thought so, or else he wouldn't have tested its defenses at Zipatra. But this turned out to be a big mistake, for the response of the new caliph, al-Mu'tasim, was as swift and devastating as anything his predecessors would have done. In 838 AD, al-Mu'tasim disregarded the advice of his ministers and set out in the dead of winter to invade Asia Minor. Once there, he made a beeline for the town of Amorion, the hometown of Theophilus. Not only was the town reduced to rubble, but al-Mu'tasim couldn't resist adding insult to injury. "The least of the territories ruled by the least of my subjects," the caliph reportedly told the Byzantine emperor, "provides a revenue larger than your whole dominion." In a final flourish, al-Mu'tasim pulled down 2 iron gates from Theophilus's hometown and took them away as trophies. He dumped one of them into the Tigris River, then installed the other at the entrance to his own palace. By this time, that palace was no longer in Baghdad, but rather in the newly built city of Samarra. Founded by al-Mu'tasim himself in the year 836 AD, Samarra was a custom-built city about 70 miles north of Baghdad that was designed to serve as the new capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. Though it would only fulfill this destiny for a little more than half a century, the ruins of ancient Samarra continue to fascinate archaeologists and historians alike. For here, far out in the middle of an arid and seemingly empty tract of desert, 3 caliphs would commission a luxurious city from scratch. By the time the capital was moved back to Baghdad at the end of the 9th century, Samarra was home to a host of ornate palaces, 2 massive mosques, hundreds of acres of gardens and canals, monumental stairways, and a series of racecourses, polo grounds, and military encampments. Though other Muslim cities may have been built just as grandly and occupied for far longer, Samarra is the only one whose original layout and ruins have been preserved relatively intact down to the present day. If you've ever wondered what those palaces or mosques mentioned in the Arabian Nights might have looked like, the ruins of Samarra are the closest we'll ever get to being able to see them today. In 2007, in recognition of its singular importance in the history of Islamic architecture and cultural history, Samarra was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In this lecture, we're going to explore the enigmatic ruins of the world the Abbasids created, one of the lesser-known yet most important civilizations of the Middle East. The founding of Samarra came about 200 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. In the middle of the 7th century AD, Muhammad's most devoted followers, known as the Companions, pondered how best to fill the vacuum created by his passing. The solution they came up with was the office of the caliph, an Arabic word that simply means deputy or successor. Though it was initially left unclear whether the caliph was envisioned simply as Muhammad's deputy or as God's representative on earth. Any ambiguity was soon dispelled by the first great Muslim empire, the Umayyad Caliphate. During the latter half of the 7th century to the first half of the 8th, an Arab tribal confederation succeeded in conquering a vast expanse of territory and subjects in the name of Islam. At its height, the Umayyad Caliphate stretched from the Indus River in the east to the shores of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula in the west, with its capital at Damascus in present-day Syria. In the year 750, after nearly a century of swift expansion rarely seen in world history, the Umayyads were pushed out by a new military alliance of Arabs and Persians known as the Abbasids. Though the Abbasid Caliphs would always be picked from a line of descent that could be traced back to one of the Prophet Muhammad's uncles, they were still a diverse lot. Among the nearly 40 caliphs to rule over Abbasid domains were many who had Greek, Turkish, Armenian, or Abyssinian mothers. Now, the Abbasids set up their new capital in Baghdad, along the Tigris River, in 762 AD. Calling on engineers and architects throughout the Islamic world, the Abbasids designed a planned city laid out in the shape of a vast circle nearly 10,000 feet wide. Baghdad was surrounded by brick walls decorated with colorful tiles, with a large open space in the center for a showcase palace and a mosque. At its height, Baghdad was home to more than 1 million people and was an intellectual, economic, and cultural powerhouse of the medieval world, matched only by Constantinople. Abbasid Baghdad was a sight to behold. Located at the confluence of the Tigris River and the many trading routes between Persia and the Levant that crisscrossed this region, Baghdad grew quickly as a commercial entrepot for the Arab world. Soon after its construction, a Chinese traveler named Du Huan passed through Baghdad. "Everything produced from the earth is available there," he later wrote. Brocade, embroidered silks, pearls, and other gems are displayed all over markets and street shops. The original core of the city, called the City of Peace in some accounts, was where the Abbasids situated their grand palaces, but also great gardens and libraries. Baghdad became an unrivaled center of learning in the early Middle Ages, making enormous contributions to the world of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and geography. But sadly, there are hardly any traces left today of the glory of Abbasid Baghdad. So, to get any sense of this era, we must look beyond the modern city. One of the earliest sites that showcases Abbasid architecture and culture is the Al-Uqadir Palace, dated to about 775 AD. And in this early structure, remarkably well preserved for a region that has seen many empires and wars sweep over it, we can see the design features and strategic considerations that set the Abbasids apart. Al-Uqadir is a stronghold located atop an important historical route between the Tigris and the Levant, and undoubtedly, control of the major trade and transportation routes was key to holding power in this era. But the Abbasids built on a grand scale, and even a regional palace like this one covers a large area, at least compared to the more smaller and more efficient castles of the previous Umayyad period. Stone is rare in the Arabian deserts, so brick, sometimes faced with stucco or plaster, was the most economic material from which to build, especially on scales such as this. The palace-cum-fortress features an interlocking series of courtyards, residences, and a mosque. And archaeological evidence indicates the governor went wanting for a little else at this remote site, as there was an extensive reception and feasting hall and many servants' quarters as well. Inside, we find repeated use of barrel vaulting and long colonnades, and on the exterior, vaulted rectangular entryways known as iwans. Such architectural features demonstrate the influence of the Persians, for whom the iwan is an iconic structure and still found in their mosques today. But despite the grandiosity of the round city of Baghdad and the grand palace fortresses like this one that guarded its approach, not even a century passed before a plan was hatched for a new Abbasid capital, this time at Samarra, about 8 miles to the north. And this new capital was planned on an even grander scale than Baghdad. The field of its ruins covers some 14,000 acres along a 30-mile stretch of the eastern bank of the Tigris River. By way of comparison, the ruins of Pompeii encompass only about 150 acres. Situated on a flat desert steppe vulnerable to floods, most of its exposed ruins have been reduced by the elements to a forest of clay stumps no taller than the height of an adult man. But if we look just a little bit closer, we can still recover a surprising amount of detail about the people and buildings that once populated this ghostly desert plain. The origins of Samarra lie with a single man, Al-Mutasim, the celebrated 8th Caliph of the Abbasid Empire. But he was never meant to be Caliph. His father excluded him from consideration for the succession out of fear that he wasn't studious enough to make for a good statesman. So Al-Mutasim took matters into his own hands, seizing power from his siblings many years after his father's death. He then consolidated control over the empire by relying on a professional army made up largely of Turkic slave soldiers from Central Asia and the Caucasus region. This highly disciplined new army effectively replaced the mixed Arab and Persian army that had brought the Abbasids to power back in 750 AD. But these new soldiers did not receive a warm welcome from the prosperous residents of Baghdad, and tensions quickly escalated. To solve the problem, in the year 836, al-Mu'tasim commissioned a new capital upstream at Samarra, and he took his feared Turkic troops with him. And we can begin our tour of Samarra as al-Mu'tasim and his Turkic bodyguards might have begun it. That is, we arrive by boat on the Tigris River, then disembark at a riverfront garden not far from the Bab al-Amma, a monumental gateway that served as a grand entrance to the Caliph's premier palace. Here, scholars see the architectural influence of earlier ancient empires. In this case, the Arch of Ctesiphon, just south of Baghdad, which was built by the Persian Sasanian Empire just a few centuries before the rise of Islam. In the early 20th century, excavations of the central Iwan resulted in the discovery of several fragments of ornate stucco decoration still clinging to the inner surfaces of the walls. Most of these designs are done in what is known as a beveled technique, in which naturalistic elements such as vines, leaves, and branches are presented as complex geometric forms. Larger panels recovered from Samarra, preserved in museums today, reveal how extensive and detailed the decorative program of the city was. The basic brick structures that remain on the site are a far cry from what we would have seen arriving 1,200 years ago. Now, once through the Bab al-Amma, we arrive at the showcase palace of Samarra, the Dar al-Khalifa, or House of the Caliph. Though much remains unexcavated, archaeologists have been able to reconstruct its almost inconceivable size. Laid out on an east-west axis, the palace grounds covered a whopping 432 acres, making it by far one of the largest palace complexes ever built in the Arab world. 172 of these acres alone were adorned with gardens and fountains. And this was just one of the many palaces that Abbasid elites built at Samarra, albeit the grandest by far. In fact, the name Samarra itself is thought to derive from an Arabic phrase, Sura man ra'a, which means, he who sees it is delighted. Not surprisingly, this was where the Caliph al-Mu'tasim chose to preside over his medieval Islamic court. After passing from the Bab al-Amma through a series of entryways and courts, the visitor enters what was once a domed chamber laid out in a cruciform shape. This was most likely the main audience hall. Here, the Caliph would have presided over official audiences and heard public petitions every Monday and Thursday. These sorts of audiences could be fearfully formal. Everyone present was expected to adopt proper speech, proper dress, and proper comportment. The Islamic monarchy, it seems, had come a long way from its humble origins in the rustic and informal social hierarchy of Arab nomadic confederations. But still the Caliph found time for moments of levity and mirth. Just to the east of the audience hall, archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of a large rectangular courtyard with a central fountain. It was almost certainly planted with some of the abundant gardens found throughout the palace complex. One of the caliphs at Samarra was particularly obsessed with roses, calling them the king of flowers in the same way that the caliph was a sovereign over rulers. He even sent one of his courtiers to distant Lahore in present-day Pakistan to obtain samples of aloes wood with its rich and distinctive scent. Of course, it wasn't easy to water all of these plants. Archaeologists have, however, been able to find traces of underground canals that carried water from up to 25 miles upstream on the Tigris River. The water was then further distributed throughout the town by use of water wheels, which, if our sources are to be believed, were sometimes powered by ostriches, though more likely they were simply decorated with images of them. The exotic plants and colorful world of Abbasid gardens at Samarra are long gone, but artifacts recovered from the site still suggest some of the splendor that was found here. The Abbasids were incredible glassblowers and were known for rediscovering a technique known as millefiori, or thousand flowers in Italian. With it, elaborate patterns are created by taking slices of heated glass rods and molding them into vessels. The result is often a floral-looking arrangement. Indeed, this example from the period may have been inspired by cherished rose gardens of Samarra. Another tangible remnant can be seen in lusterware, a type of iridescent pottery that was invented by the Abbasids and likely developed through their experimentation with glassware. Lusterware is traditionally made using a preparation of metal salts, usually copper or silver, as a second glaze on a plate or vessel that is then fired again at a lower temperature. The resulting metal oxides create a metallic sheen to the pottery. Numerous examples of lusterware have been found in Samarra, with particularly large examples unearthed from the palaces, featuring a variety of designs, ranging from geometric patterns to depictions of the natural world. Some depict exotic foreign birds from as far away as India, another hint as to the extent of the Abbasid menagerie. Abbasid glassware and pottery also reveal wide-ranging influences. Imported Tang Dynasty pottery has been excavated both at Samarra and at other archaeological sites throughout the Caliphate. The influence went both ways, with Islamic motifs appearing on Chinese porcelain around this time as well, a testament to the new levels of trade and cultural exchange between the Near East and the Far East along the Silk Road in this period. Archaeologists have also found tantalizing fragments of wall murals and other decorations that were recovered during the first excavations of Samarra in the early 20th century, which have allowed for decorative reconstructions. The German archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld, in particular, used these small samples to create painstaking reconstructions that drew upon the patterns and styles of other surviving sculpture and metalwork in nearby regions. Perhaps the most famous of Herzfeld's reconstructions is that of two Samarran dancers. The imagery and colors are striking. Two dancers with long braids facing a mirror image of her partner. Distinguished only by the stark contrast in colors on their flowing dresses and scarves, each dancer deftly pours liquid into a bowl that is balanced precariously around the back side of her neck and over the interlocking arm of her partner. Another striking painting depicts a woman and her dog hunting a deer, with a fatal strike to the head. The layered dress of the huntress and the brace of her leg into the deer's torso seem to suggest a vigorous struggle, while the unusual colors and patterns of both the dog and deer point to a considerable storehouse of creative techniques and artistic leeway. We should imagine that the walls of the Dar al-Khalifa would have been filled with such striking works. Al-Mutasim did not oversee his new capital for long, and he died in 842 AD. But his immediate successors chose to remain at Samarra and build upon it further. And it was the Caliph al-Mutawakkil, taking the throne in 847 AD, who took the building frenzy to new extremes. But unlike his predecessors, al-Mutawakkil didn't just build new palaces and pleasure grounds. Instead, he commissioned the only structures whose ancient splendor continues to tower over the desert landscape today. Two magnificent mosques whose iconic spiral minarets have inspired countless architectural copycats. But neither was near the palaces, which were built about a mile north of the ancient city. As religious institutions designed for public engagement, the mosques were built where the people lived, not where the caliph lived. To get there, we'll need to head south along broad avenues that once stretched nearly 200 feet wide. These roads would have been the backdrop for several different types of grand processions over the course of a caliph's reign. First and foremost, al-Mutawakkil himself would have made the mile-long journey at least once every week to attend Friday prayer at the mosque. Abbasid poets immortalized this weekly trek in verse, describing in detail the jostling of the young and the old along the road and near the mosque as everyone struggled to catch a glimpse of the caliph humbling himself before Allah. But sometimes these avenues played host to a scene more profane than pious. In the year 855, an Abyssinian rebel nicknamed Ali Baba was captured and paraded through the streets of Samarra en route to a grisly execution near the Dar al-Khalifa. The event was commemorated with a medal that shows al-Mutawakkil on one side, dressed in formal Persian attire, and a man on a camel being led by a rider on the reverse side. On at least one occasion, we know that a captured rebel was paraded through town on the back of an elephant, whose greater height gave onlookers a better view of the condemned. Construction on the Great Mosque began in 848 and was completed 4 years later. Located in the northwestern corner of the present-day city, the Great Mosque was designed to exceed the grandeur of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. Though only the walls and bases of columns survive today, they give us a pretty good idea of its dimensions. With a fountain at its center, 16 doorways, 1 prayer hall, and 3 porticos, all arranged around an open courtyard for congregation of the faithful, the Great Mosque covered a total area of nearly 41,000 square feet. For many centuries, it was the largest mosque in the Islamic world. And fittingly for the artistic talents of the Abbasids, archaeologists now believe that the walls of the mosque would have been covered in glass or glazed panels. Though constructed with a far more modest decorative program in mind, the Mosque of Ahmed ibn Tulun in Cairo, built just 2 decades later, gives us a pretty good idea of what the Great Mosque in Samarra might have looked like before the deterioration of its roof. But it is the Grand Mosque's unique spiral minaret that steals the show at Samarra today. Known as the Malwiya Tower, it is a freestanding structure located just outside the northern wall. This is unusual, since many minarets rise from the walls and corners of the mosques they serve. Clearly, this was a minaret that was intended to be admired. And that admiration could be done from a great distance. The Malwiya Tower rises to 171 feet high, about the same height as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Though its function is clear, to announce the daily call to prayer, the inspiration for its design is not. Scholars speculate that the ancient Babylonian ziggurat may have provided a blueprint for its striking spiral ascent, but no one is quite certain. What is certain is that Samarra's spiral minaret has in turn inspired many other iconic works of architecture, both within and without the Islamic world. And though the exact origins of the minaret in Islamic architecture are unclear, the Malwiya Tower is one of the earliest preserved and the largest. After the construction of the Great Mosque at Samarra, minarets became standard additions to mosques throughout the Abbasid world, and now have become arguably the most iconic feature of Islamic architecture. Unfortunately, al-Mutawakkil was unable to stop while he was ahead. The Great Mosque, as splendid as it was, just wasn't a sufficiently grand expression of the Caliph's ambition and power. As a result, al-Mutawakkil decided to build an entirely new city even further north of Samarra, complete with even more palaces and another mosque. Not only that, but he named his new city after himself, al-Mutawakkilia. As with the ruins of Samarra, the spiral minaret of the new mosque, known as the Abu Dulaf, is the only structure still standing relatively intact today. With its completion, al-Mutawakkil had now built 2 massive mosques in little more than a decade, a stunning demonstration of his political and cultural power. Though the spiral minaret of the Abu Dulaf Mosque is about 70 feet shorter than the one at Samarra, it is somewhat better preserved. Part of the reason is due not to the neglect of time, but rather to modern-day conflicts. In 2005, the Malwiya Tower was damaged by an American bomb dropped during the conflict in Iraq. After the construction of a brand new city named after himself, al-Mutawakkil began to face growing opposition from the same people who had originally brought his father to power, his Turkic army. All this lavish spending constituted a severe drain on the treasury. Meanwhile, the Turkic soldiers were idle and restless, and resentful of all the funds directed towards wasteful and opulent palaces not meant for themselves. In the year 861, some of them decided to take matters into their own hands, assassinating the drunk caliph at a masquerade party in one of his palaces. Chronic instability followed, and several of the caliph's successors were also murdered at the hands of the Turkic soldiers. There was a brief reprieve in the 870s under the Caliph al-Mu'tamid, who managed to stay on the throne for a couple of decades, though it seems much of the true power lay with his brother and various viziers, as well as the increasingly autonomous and sometimes openly rebellious governors of the far-flung empire. There was a last burst of construction at Samarra, however, including the best-preserved palace on the site, Qasr al-Ashiq. Located about 10 miles west of the main site of Samarra, it may have been constructed with security in mind. Far from the vast pleasure gardens of the Caliphal palace, here we find imposing walls, deep vaults, and the remnants of a moat around the exterior. And though still a large building, it is not nearly as grand in scale as suggested by the remains of previous palaces in Samarra. Qasr al-Ashiq was little occupied, it seems, as al-Mu'tamid seems to have spent less and less time in Samarra. And it was his successor in 892 AD who gave up on Samarra altogether, relocating the capital back to Baghdad. Having served as the capital for a mere 56 years, Samarra didn't have enough time to develop a diverse economy or attract a large civilian population that could withstand the withdrawal of imperial subsidies. It didn't take long for the dikes on the Tigris to deteriorate, for floods to wreak havoc on agriculture, and for the complex urban irrigation network to collapse. By the late 12th century, one Muslim traveler characterized Samarra as, quote, a ruin, a wasteland, at the sight of which the viewer took fright. Still, the power and authority of the Abbasid Caliphs lived on for several more centuries, just not in Samarra. In fact, even as the military reach of the Caliphs began to contract in the 11th and 12th centuries, their political endorsement was still eagerly courted by ambitious warlords throughout the Old Caliphate. In this respect, they played a role similar to that of the Pope, whose spiritual blessing was deemed essential to the rise of a European monarch. One of the best examples of the continued influence of the Abbasid Caliphs can be seen in the remarkable minaret at Jam in Afghanistan, also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Built in 1194 and rising up to more than 200 feet high, the Jam minaret was the tallest one in the Islamic world. But look closer, and we can see that its surface contains an inscription that mentions the Sultan's newly acquired titles from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, partner of the commander of the faithful. Some historians even believe that the Jam minaret may have been built specifically to commemorate the bestowal of this title by the Caliph. And we can no longer find much physical evidence of the more than 5 centuries in which the Abbasid Caliphs presided over one of the most vibrant, powerful, and sophisticated empires in world history. Their intangible legacies, of course, are everywhere, in the art and architecture of their many cultural descendants across Eurasia, and in the political, military, and legal institutions of later Muslim empires, such as the Ottomans. If you want to see traces of the original imperial blueprint for the Islamic world, there is simply no substitute for picking up a spade and digging in the desert of Samarra.